It was late in the dry season when our tank crew received an urgent order to move before sunset. We had been parked near a small supply point for only a few hours after a week of endless marches across Cambodia. The engine was finally cool, and for the first time in days, we thought we might sleep without our boots on. That hope lasted less than 10 minutes. A messenger from battalion headquarters climbed onto our tank and handed over a folded map. A friendly infantry company had gone silent somewhere beyond a cluster of villages hidden behind thick forest. Radio contact had been lost just before dawn. No one knew if they had been delayed, ambushed, or forced to change position. Our platoon was ordered to move immediately, clear the road, and support the infantry column following behind us. I was the tank commander then, barely 23 years old. Inside our cramped steel compartment were 3 men I trusted with my life. Wah was our driver, a quiet mechanic from Nam Dinh who could somehow hear problems inside an engine before anyone else noticed them. He always said that after the war he wanted to open a repair shop where the loudest sound would be customers laughing instead of diesel engines roaring. Our gunner, Tam, came from Quang Ngai. He rarely talked about himself except when he mentioned his mother, who had been sick for years. Every letter from home ended the same way: "Come back safely." That's all I ask. Tam carried those words folded inside his shirt pocket, protected by a small piece of plastic. The youngest was Loy, our loader. He had just turned 20. Unlike the rest of us, he could still joke during long marches. He dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher one day because, as he often said, children deserved to grow up hearing stories instead of gunfire. Before climbing aboard, we shared a quick meal of dried rice softened with canteen water. My dented aluminum canteen had been with me since crossing the border months earlier. It had survived falls, explosions, and more careless drops than I could count. Around us, soldiers checked rifles, tightened packs, and quietly finished the last bites of food. Nobody wasted words before a mission like this. The moment Wah started the engine, the familiar smell of diesel fuel and hot oil filled the fighting compartment. The entire tank vibrated beneath our boots. The noise was so loud that conversation became little more than hand signals and short shouts through the intercom. Outside, the steel tracks bit into the red Cambodian earth, crushing loose rocks and broken branches as we rolled forward. Behind us, the infantry advanced in careful formation, using our armor as cover whenever the trail narrowed. The road was barely wide enough for a tank. Fallen trees, abandoned carts, and deep shell craters slowed our progress. Every few hundred yards, we stopped while engineers checked suspicious sections of the trail. The jungle around us seemed strangely quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. As darkness settled over the forest, the orange glow of several distant fires suddenly appeared beyond the trees. They were too scattered to be artillery strikes and too steady to be ordinary campfires. Wah eased off the throttle without waiting for my order. Inside the tank, none of us spoke. We all stared toward the burning horizon, each silently wondering the same thing. What had happened in that village before we arrived? The trail narrowed after the first mile, and our tank became less like a fighting machine and more like a steel plow forcing its way through a country that did not want to be crossed. The trees leaned in close on both sides. Branches scraped against the turret with a dry, angry sound. Every few yards, Wah had to slow down and feel the ground through the tracks, judging by instinct whether the red earth could hold us or swallow us. That was something civilians rarely understood about tanks. They looked at the armor and the gun and thought nothing could stop such a vehicle. But in Cambodia, mud could stop you, a rotten bridge could stop you. One tree root hidden underwater could break your track and turn a tank into a dead bunker. I stood half out of the commander's hatch, one hand gripping the rim, the other pressing the headset tight against my ear. Behind us, the infantry moved in short bursts, using the shadow of our tank whenever the road opened into dangerous clearings. Their faces were streaked with dust and sweat. Some were no older than Loy. We reached the first obstacle just before full dark. A large tree had been cut across the trail. It had not fallen naturally. The trunk was too cleanly placed, and the branches had been trimmed to make it harder to push aside. I signaled the infantry to spread out, then ordered Wah forward. Easy, I told him through the intercom. Do not rush it. The engine growled. The tank nudged the trunk once. Then again. The steel tracks chewed into the soil, throwing red dirt behind us. For a moment, the tree held, then it rolled with a cracking sound, and the path opened just wide enough for the column to pass. Inside the turret, Tam kept his eye near the sight. Calm as always. Too quiet, he said. Nobody answered, because he was right. A little farther on, the ground changed. The red dirt gave way to a low, wet patch covered by thin grass. In daylight, we might have gone around it. At night, with infantry depending on us and the silent company still somewhere ahead, we had no time for a wide detour. Wah took us in slowly. The tank sank almost at once. The left track dropped deep, and the whole vehicle tilted. Metal groaned beneath us. Lloyd cursed under his breath, then grabbed a tool bag before I even gave the order. We all knew what had to be done. I climbed down first, boots sinking into mud up to my ankles. The smell hit me immediately, wet earth, hot oil, and old jungle water. Under the weak beam of a cupboard flashlight, Wah and Loy worked near the left track while Tam stayed in the turret, watching the tree line with the machine gun ready. Mosquitoes swarmed our faces. Somewhere behind me, an infantryman coughed with that dry, tired sound men got after weeks of malaria and poor sleep. My own shirt was soaked, though the night air had turned cool. We dug, cursed, pushed branches under the track, and tried again. The engine roared. The tank lurched forward 1 foot, then slipped back. Wah slammed his fist against the side armor. One more time, he said, breathing hard. She'll climb out. He talked about the tank like it was alive. Maybe all drivers did. We cleared more mud. Loy, still trying to make us laugh, said that if he ever became a teacher, he would never punish a student by making him dig. I have done enough digging for 3 lifetimes, he said. Even Tam smiled at that. On the 3rd try, the left track caught. The tank rose out of the mud with a heavy sucking sound. Like the earth itself was unwilling to let go. The infantryman nearby gave a soft cheer. Not loud enough to carry into the forest, but loud enough for us to feel human again. We moved on, slower now, more careful. The fires ahead had grown brighter. Then, in the mud beside the trail, I saw fresh footprints, many of them. Bare feet, sandals, and military boots, all heading toward the village beyond the trees. I raised my hand for the column to halt. Those tracks had been made only hours before. We reached the edge of the village just after the last light had disappeared from the sky. I remember that moment more clearly than many battles. Maybe because nothing happened at first. No shots, no shouting, no dogs barking from under the houses. Only the heavy breathing of our tank engine and the soft shuffle of infantry boots behind us. In most villages, even frightened ones, there was always some sign of life. A cooking fire, a child crying, a water buffalo shifting in its pen. Here, everything seemed frozen. The houses stood on stilts, dark and still, their ladders pulled up or broken. A few cooking pots sat near cold ashes. In one doorway, a woven basket had been dropped on its side, spilling a handful of rice into the dirt. I told Wah to keep the tank moving at a crawl. The steel tracks pressed into the red earth with a slow grinding sound that felt too loud for that place. Every board on every house seemed to listen to us pass. Tam rotated the turret a few degrees at a time. Never hurried, never careless. His eyes stayed close to the sight. Loy crouched low near the ammunition rack, both hands resting on a shell he hoped he would not have to load. I could hear his breathing over the intercom. Still nothing? Wah asked. Nothing, I said. Keep straight. A squad of infantry moved along our left side, checking the spaces between the houses. Another squad slipped to the right, using the tank as a wall of steel between them and the tree line. We had practiced that kind of coordination many times, but in a real village at night, with every window looking like a rifle muzzle, training only carried you halfway. The rest came from trust. We stopped near a small well in the center of the village. The air smelled of smoke, but not like an active fire. It was an old, bitter smell, mixed with damp wood and something I did not want to name. A few thin trails of smoke still rose from cook fires that had been abandoned hours earlier. I climbed halfway out of the hatch and listened. That was when I noticed the silence was not empty. It was full of fear. A young infantry lieutenant came up beside the tank and whispered that his men had found no enemy, but also no clear sign of where the villagers had gone. A radio operator tried again to reach the missing company. Static answered him, nothing else. We pushed deeper, toward the far end of the village. The fires we had seen from the trail were not houses burning, as we first feared. They were small piles of clothing and broken wooden tools, still glowing in scattered places along the path. Someone had burned them quickly and moved on. Wah muttered something from inside the hole. He was not a man who scared easily, but that night his voice sounded older. Near the last house, one of the infantrymen raised his hand. Everyone froze. At first, I saw only shadow beneath the stairs. Then the shadow moved. Two soldiers approached carefully and found an old Khmer man crouched in the darkness, his body trembling so hard he could barely stand. He wore a torn black shirt and had mud dried across one side of his face. His eyes did not look at our weapons. They looked past us, toward the forest behind the village. The lieutenant tried speaking softly. None of us understood all his words, but fear has its own language. The old man gripped the lieutenant's sleeve, pointed toward the trees, and began to cry. Then he said one name, broken and bitter, that all of us understood. Pon Pot. No one moved for a second. The tank engine rumbled beneath me, steady and alive, but inside my chest something went cold. That village had not been caught in a battle. Something else had happened there before we arrived. And the answer was waiting in the forest. We moved toward the forest in silence, following the old man's trembling hand more than any map. He would not come with us. I could not blame him. Whatever he had seen beyond those trees had emptied the strength from his legs. The infantry spread out ahead, and our tank crawled behind them, slow enough not to crush the narrow footpath but close enough to cover them if shooting started. Wah kept the engine low. Though a tank could never truly be quiet, the tracks ground over roots and dry leaves, making a heavy metallic sound that seemed to roll through the jungle like distant thunder. Inside the turret, Tam whispered over the intercom, "Commander, this does not feel like an ambush." I knew what he meant. Ambushes had their own smell, their own rhythm. Men hiding with rifles often gave themselves away by small things: a broken branch, a bird suddenly taking flight, a patch of grass pressed flat. But this forest felt different. It felt abandoned after something terrible had already passed through. After a few hundred yards, the infantry lieutenant raised his fist. The column stopped. I climbed halfway out of the hatch and looked ahead through the dim light. At first, I saw only disturbed soil. Then my eyes adjusted, and I noticed the shapes. Fresh mounds, not one or two, but many, scattered between the trees. Some were shallow, some had been covered in haste with leaves and branches. Nearby lay torn black clothing, broken sandals, and cooking bowls cracked in half. No one spoke. War had shown us bodies before. It had shown us burned trucks, shattered bunkers, and young soldiers carried back under ponchos. But this was different. There was no sign of a firefight here. No shell craters, no spent casings spread across the ground. This place had not been a battlefield. It had been a place where people were brought because someone had decided they no longer deserved to live. A Cambodian man from the village, younger than the first old man, was found hiding behind a fallen tree. He spoke some broken Vietnamese. Piece by piece, between sobs and pauses, he told us what had happened. The night before, Pol Pot soldiers had entered the village, but they were not only hunting civilians. They had gathered their own people too. Men accused of being weak. Families accused of helping Vietnamese troops. Local cadres suspected of disloyalty. It had been a purge, fast and secret, carried out before dawn. Those who could run had fled into the dark. Those who could not were taken here. That was the secret of the night purge. Not a battle plan, not a hidden weapon, just fear turned against everyone, even their own. I remember looking down at my hands. They were black with grease from the tank. The same hands I used to signal fire, to hold binoculars, to pull my crew out of danger. For a moment, they felt useless. A tank could push through jungle, break roadblocks, and shield infantry from bullets. But it could not give back a mother, a son, or a village its sleep. Loy, still crouched inside the turret, said nothing. Tam lowered his head. Wah kept both hands on the controls, staring straight ahead as if discipline alone could hold him together. The lieutenant ordered his men to continue checking the area. We stayed in position, gun facing the darker side of the forest. I forced myself to watch the tree line, not the mounds. Then a single shot cracked from somewhere ahead. A second followed. Tam snapped back to the sight. "Contact front," he shouted. And just like that, grief had to wait. The first shots came from the right side of the tree line. Sharp and scattered, not like a full attack but enough to pin the infantry in place. Dirt jumped near the lieutenant's boots. One soldier dropped flat behind a fallen log. Another crawled backward, dragging his radio by the strap. "Tam, suppress that edge," I shouted. The turret swung with a low mechanical whine. Tam did not waste fire. He gave a short burst from the machine gun into the bushes where the muzzle flashes had blinked. The forest answered with silence for 3 seconds. Then more rifle fire cracked from farther left. They were moving. Wah eased the tank forward to cover the infantry. The steel hull became a wall between our men and the dark woods. I could see soldiers pressing close to the side armor, their hands on the warm metal, faces tight with fear and discipline. That was the job of armor in a place like that, not to win a grand battle, but to keep young men alive long enough to move. "Forward 5 meters," I told Wah. "Slow." The tank crawled ahead. The tracks crushed branches and churned the soft ground. Then came a hard jolt from under the left side, followed by a grinding sound that made every man inside freeze. Wah cursed once, not loud, just enough. "What is it?" I asked. "Left side is binding," he said. "Something caught near the road wheel. Maybe a root, maybe metal." The tank shuddered again. The left track dragged, then slipped. We were still moving, but not cleanly. If we forced it too hard, we might throw the track entirely. In that jungle, at night, under fire, a disabled tank would become both shield and target. I ordered Wah to stop behind a thick stand of trees where the hull still protected the infantry. Rounds snapped above us, cutting leaves loose. Tam kept watching through his sight, breathing slow. Loy had already pulled the repair tools from their rack. He knew the sound as well as the rest of us. The radio crackled. I tried to call the second tank behind us. Nothing but static. I changed frequency and tried battalion. Static again. That was when I felt the weight of being alone. A tank crew was 4 men inside steel. But in battle you were never supposed to be only 4. You were part of a line, a formation, a plan. Lose communication, and suddenly the jungle became much bigger. "We fix it here," I said. Wah looked back from his driver's position. In the dim light, his face was streaked with sweat and grease. "Under fire?" "Under fire," I answered. There was no other choice. We opened the hatch just enough to get out. The night air rushed in hot and wet. carrying the smell of mud, burned cloth, gunpowder, and diesel exhaust. I slid down the side armor first, keeping low. Loy followed with the tool bag pressed to his chest. Wah came last, moving like a man leaving part of himself behind in the driver's seat. Tam stayed inside, covering us. Under the covered beam of a flashlight, we found the problem. A thick branch, wrapped with wire and packed in mud, had wedged itself near the left road wheel and track guard. It was not a proper mine, not even a clever trap, just a dirty little obstruction placed where a tank would suffer most. Wah lay on his side in the mud, reaching into the gap with both hands. Loy passed him tools. I held the flashlight low, shielding it with my palm so the beam would not carry through the forest. Bullets snapped through the leaves overhead. Faster, I whispered, though I hated myself for saying it. Wah did not look up, then tell the branch to cooperate. Even there, with rounds coming in and the smell of death still behind us. Loy gave a short laugh. It lasted less than a second, but I remember it. That laugh told me we were still ourselves. Then Tam's voice exploded over the intercom from inside the tank. Movement front, close. A burst of rifle fire tore across the clearing, striking sparks from our side armor. The flashlight went out in my hand. For a few seconds, the darkness owned us. The flashlight had gone dead, either from my thumb hitting the switch or from a bullet striking close enough to knock it from my hand. I could hear Loy breathing beside me, fast and uneven. Wah was still half under the left side of the tank, one arm buried near the jammed road wheel. Above us, Tam fired another short burst from the machine gun, the sound hammering through the steel hull and rolling across the trees. "Get back inside," Tam shouted over the intercom. I wanted to obey. Every bit of training said to get the crew under armor, return fire, and move, but the tank could not move. Not yet. If we left that branch and wire jammed in place, we might throw the track the moment Wah tried to turn. Then we would block the whole path, trapping the infantry in the open. "Keep covering," I shouted back. I found the flashlight in the mud and slapped it against my palm. Once, twice, a weak yellow beam came back, shaking across Hoa's hands. His knuckles were bleeding. He had cut himself on the wire but kept working without a sound. Loy crouched low, handing him the wrench. "Almost there," Wah said through his teeth. "Hold the light steady." That was when a round struck the ground near Loy's boot. Mud slapped across his pants. He flinched backward and hit the side armor hard. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him down. "You hit?" "No," he said, but his voice was thin. Then he looked at me, and I saw the fear he had been hiding behind jokes for months. He was 20 years old. He wanted to teach children how to read, not crawl in mud beside a disabled tank while rifle fire cut leaves above his head. I remember thinking of his mother. Though I had never met her, I thought of Hoa's repair shop that did not exist yet. I thought of Tam's folded letter inside his shirt. All those small futures were packed inside our tank with the ammunition, tools, sweat, and diesel fumes. The radio operator from the infantry crawled close to us. His face was pale under the dirt. "Commander," he said, "the lieutenant says we need armor forward. Enemy is pulling back through the east path. If your tank can move, you must come now." I looked at Wah. He pulled hard one last time. The branch came loose with a wet crack, wire still wrapped around it like a snake. "She can move," he said, "but I need 1 minute to check the track." 1 minute. In combat, 1 minute could be nothing or a lifetime. If we moved immediately, we might help cut off the enemy force slipping away through the forest. We might protect the infantry before they took more casualties. That was the mission. But Loy was still outside the tank, shaken and exposed. Hoa's hands were bleeding. The left track might hold, or it might fail after 10 meters and leave us stranded in a worse place. The proper military answer was to move as soon as possible. The human answer was not so simple. Another burst of fire came from the trees. Tam answered from inside the turret. "Commander," he called. "They are closer on the left." The infantryman looked at me. Waiting. Wah looked at the track. Loi looked at the open hatch as if it were the only safe place left in Cambodia. I had to choose quickly. Push the tank forward and risk my crew. Or take the time to secure my men and maybe lose the chance to complete the mission exactly as ordered. I still remember the taste of mud in my mouth when I made that decision. I made the decision before I knew how I would explain it. "Everybody inside," I said. "Now." The infantry radio man stared at me as if he had not heard right. "Commander," the lieutenant said. I heard him. I cut in. "Tell him we will move when the crew and the tank are ready. Not before." There was no pride in my voice. No anger either. Just the hard, flat tone men use when they know there is no time left to argue. I grabbed Loi by the back of his shirt and pushed him toward the hatch. He climbed in first, slipping on the muddy armor. Wah followed, still holding his bleeding hand against his chest. I climbed in last, and the moment the hatch slammed shut above us, the tank felt both like a coffin and a home. Inside, everything smelled of sweat, grease, cordite, and wet mud. Loi dropped into his place beside the ammunition rack, trying to pretend his hands were not shaking. Wah slid back into the driver's seat and flexed his fingers around the controls. Blood ran across his knuckles, but his grip was steady. "Can you drive?" I asked. Wah did not turn around. "I can drive." That was all I needed. "Tam, give them a wall." The turret shifted left. Tam fired 2 short bursts, then paused. He was careful, as always. He never sprayed the jungle blindly. He fired where he saw movement, where the flashes came from, where the infantry needed a few seconds to breathe. The gunfire pushed the enemy back just enough for the soldiers outside to drag their wounded behind thicker cover. I ordered Wah to reverse 5 meters instead of charging forward. It was a small movement, but it mattered. We backed into a shallow depression between 2 trees, where the hull shielded more of the infantry line and gave Wah room to test the left track. The tank jerked once, groaned, then settled. "Track holds," Wah said. Only then did I call to the infantry radio man through the external line and signal that we were moving. But we did not rush into the forest after the retreating enemy. I chose a slower angle, using the tank as moving cover while the infantry regrouped behind us. Maybe another commander would have pushed faster. Maybe he would have been right. I have asked myself that question for years. At that moment, I could only see the faces of my crew. Loi, who still hoped to become a teacher. Wah, whose hands knew machines better than any manual. Tam, silent behind the sight, carrying his mother's letter close to his heart. A mission mattered, orders mattered, but a tank without its crew was just dead steel. We moved forward at walking speed. Tam fired again, this time into a patch of brush where 3 figures had broken from cover. The shots scattered them. The infantry used the opening to cross a dangerous gap and reach a line of thicker trees. Someone shouted that 2 wounded men had been pulled back safely. That was when I knew my choice had not failed the mission completely. The enemy continued slipping away into the dark, but they no longer had a clear shot at our men. We kept the tank angled between the infantry and the east path, grinding over roots, stopping, firing, moving again. There was no glory in it, no charge worth putting in a history book, just steel, mud, fear, and men trying to keep one another alive. After nearly 20 minutes, the shooting thinned, then it stopped. The forest returned to that terrible silence. I sat with one hand on the radio switch, waiting for a reprimand that I felt sure would come. I had delayed movement under orders. I had chosen crew safety first. In wartime, even the right choice could look wrong on a report. Outside, the infantry lieutenant walked toward our tank, his helmet tilted, his face blackened with dirt. I opened the hatch and prepared myself for whatever he was about to say. The lieutenant climbed onto the front of our tank and looked at me for a long moment. His face was streaked with mud and smoke, and one sleeve of his uniform had been torn open. I expected anger. I expected him to ask why we had not pushed forward the moment he gave the order. Instead, he tapped the armor twice with his knuckles. "You kept the line from breaking," he said. That was all. I did not answer right away. I had been holding my breath without knowing it. Behind me, inside the turret, Tam leaned back from the sight for the first time in nearly half an hour. Wah wrapped a dirty bandage around his bleeding hand. Loy sat on the floor plates, pale but alive, his helmet resting between his knees. The lieutenant told us what had happened after we backed into the depression. Our tank's fire had forced the enemy to move wide instead of cutting straight through the infantry. That delay gave his men enough time to pull back 2 wounded soldiers and form a new line. We had not trapped the enemy, but we had kept our own men from being trapped. In war, sometimes that was the only victory you got. When dawn came, the forest looked smaller than it had during the night, but the sorrow in it had grown. The firing had stopped completely. A patrol found signs that the Pon Pot group had fled east, leaving behind a few packs, empty rice sacks, and bloody strips of cloth. We were ordered not to chase beyond the assigned boundary. Our mission changed from pursuit to securing the village and helping the survivors come out of hiding. That was when the true weight of the night settled on us. People began appearing from holes, bushes, and half-collapsed huts. Old women, thin men, children with dust in their hair and eyes too serious for their age. None of them ran toward us. They came slowly, watching our weapons, watching our faces, trying to decide whether the danger had really passed. We gave them what little we had: a few handfuls of dried rice, water from dented canteens. A medic from the infantry checked the wounded. No one spoke loudly. Even the tank seemed quieter when Wah shut down the engine. After hours of noise, the sudden silence rang in my ears. Then came the work no soldier ever forgets. We helped mark the fresh graves in the forest. The villagers showed us where their relatives had been taken. We did not dig everything open. There are things the living must know, but there are also things the dead should not be forced to show twice. We gathered names when names were known. We helped cover the shallow places properly. Some of the infantrymen removed their helmets while they worked. Tam stood beside me at one mound, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "My mother is old," he said quietly. "If something happened to me, at least she would know I was a soldier." These people disappeared in one night, and some families may never even know where to cry. I had no answer for him. Loy gave his dried rice to a little boy and then turned away quickly, pretending to adjust something on the tank. Wah checked the track again and again, though we all knew he was only keeping his hands busy. Near noon, when the sun had burned the mist off the red earth, a young Khmer girl came toward our tank. She could not have been more than 9 or 10. In both hands, she carried my dented canteen. I had given it to a group of villagers earlier and forgotten about it. She held it out to me. Around its neck, she had tied a thin red thread. I did not understand her words, but I understood her face. I took the canteen with both hands, as if it were something fragile. For the rest of that day, I kept it beside me in the turret, and every time the metal touched my knee, I remembered why we had chosen to save men before chasing shadows. We left that village the next afternoon, but none of us truly moved on from it. The order came quietly. Another unit would remain with the survivors, and our tank crew was to rejoin the column farther north. The map showed only a short distance, but in Cambodia a short distance could take all day. Roads disappeared under grass, bridges sagged over brown water. A harmless-looking patch of red earth could hide mud deep enough to swallow half a track. Wah started the engine with his bandaged hand resting carefully on the controls. The diesel coughed, spat black smoke, then settled into its familiar roar. I stood in the hatch and looked back once. A few villagers watched from beneath the stilt houses. The young girl who had tied the red thread around my canteen stood beside an older woman. She did not wave, she only looked at us. And somehow that was harder to carry. I hung the canteen inside the turret where it would not roll under our feet. The red thread was already dirty, but I did not remove it. For the next several days, we moved through country that seemed endless. Red dust covered our faces, our uniforms, even the rice we ate. We chewed dried rice straight from our palms and washed it down with warm water that tasted of metal. At night, when we stopped, the tank gave off heat like a cooking stove. We slept beside it or under it, depending on the rain and the mosquitoes. The war did not become dramatic after that night. That is the truth most stories leave out. Much of war is waiting, sweating, repairing, marching, and trying not to think too much. We changed a road wheel under a poncho during a sudden rainstorm. We cleaned mud from the track teeth with bayonets and broken branches. We topped off oil by flashlight while insects battered themselves against the beam. One night, Wah woke me because he heard a strange knock in the engine. No one else heard it at first, but Wah insisted. He and I opened the rear deck under a covered flashlight while Tam held the light and Loy slapped mosquitoes from his neck. Wah found a loose fitting before it became a real breakdown. He smiled then, tired but proud, and said, "My repair shop will have a rule. No mud allowed." Loy laughed, but not the way he used to. None of us did. The fever came 2 days later. First Loy, then Tam. Malaria moved through units like an enemy that did not need bullets. Loy shook so hard inside the turret that his teeth clicked together. We wrapped him in 2 damp blankets. Though the heat was heavy enough to make breathing difficult, Tam kept saying he was fine until he nearly fell asleep sitting upright at the gunner's position. We still had to move. Wah drove slower, softer, avoiding every rut he could. I took some of Tam's watch time. Loy kept apologizing whenever he could not help with loading or maintenance, which made me angrier than any enemy fire. A sick man should not have to apologize for being sick. During those long marches, I often touched the canteen beside my knee. Its metal was dented and scratched, and the red thread had dried stiff with dust. It reminded me of the village, of the shallow graves, of the lieutenant tapping our armor and saying we had kept the line from breaking. But it also reminded me of something else. A tank crew survives by becoming one body. The driver feels the ground. The gunner reads the threat. The loader gives speed to the weapon. The commander decides, sometimes with too little time and too much fear. If one man breaks, the whole machine becomes weaker. By the time we reached the northern assembly point, none of us spoke much about the night purge of Pon Pot. We did not have the words yet. But the canteen stayed hanging inside the turret, swinging softly whenever the tracks ground over red earth. More than 40 years have passed, but some nights still return with the smell of diesel. I am an old man now. My hands are slower. My hearing is not what it used to be, partly because of age and partly because I spent too much of my youth inside a steel box where the engine never whispered and the guns never asked permission. People sometimes ask what I remember most from the Cambodian front. They expect me to talk about big battles, maps, victories, or medals. I usually tell them I remember a dented canteen with a dirty red thread tied around its neck. That canteen sits on a shelf in my house today. The metal is dull. One side is crushed inward where it struck the floor of the tank during a night movement. The cap no longer seals properly. The red thread is faded now, almost brown, but I have never removed it. When I look at it, I see Wah first. After the war, he did open a repair shop, just as he had dreamed. It was small, with a tin roof and 2 wooden benches out front. He used to joke that civilian engines were polite compared to tank engines. But the fever never fully left him. Some years later, his health failed. At his funeral, I saw grease under his fingernails. And I thought that was right. Wah had belonged to machines, and machines had trusted him. Tam made it home to his mother. That mattered to him more than anything. He carried her letters until they nearly fell apart. He later became a quiet man in a quiet town, the kind who fixed fences, avoided arguments, and never sat with his back to a door. We met once many years after the war. He did not speak much about Cambodia. He only touched the canteen, nodded, and said, "We were lucky." Lloyd did become a teacher. That is the part one hold onto when the memories grow too dark. He taught children for decades. He wrote to me once that every time a student complained about homework, he wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. He had seen what happened when children were given fear instead of books. Maybe that was why he became patient with them. As for me, I carried the war home in small ways. Loud engines made me turn my head. The smell of wet red soil after rain could put me back in Cambodia before I had time to stop it. For years, I could not sleep well if a room was too quiet. Silence reminded me of that village, of the houses on stilts, of the old man pointing into the forest, of the secret night purge carried out by Pol Pot against civilians and even his own people. I still think about the choice we made beside that jam track. We delayed. We protected the crew. We shielded the infantry instead of charging forward blindly. Maybe someone else would have chosen differently. War gives men decisions too large for the few seconds allowed to make them. But I know this. Wah drove us out. Tam held the line. Loy lived to teach children. The infantry pulled back their wounded. And in a village that had lost almost everything, a little girl tied a red thread around my canteen as if to say that even in the middle of cruelty, human kindness had not been completely killed. That is the memory I cannot forget. Not the gunfire, not the orders, not even the fear. I remember the sound of our tracks grinding over red earth as we left, and the canteen swinging gently inside the turret, knocking against the steel like a small, stubborn heartbeat.